I guess I'm the first one from Stanford since Hank isn't here to welcome you. It's really an honor to have everybody here visit us, and I'm particularly pleased to talk to you today. It's interesting, John and I have actually known each other, I think, probably 35, 40 years, and the judge mentioned that I used to be Director of Criminal Justice at the RAND Corporation, and that was in the 70s. And interestingly enough, our bread and butter in terms of support was doing risk assessments for parole boards. And I was thinking about it, given this discussion today, how risk assessment tools used to be the province of scientists. And now they're the province of a lot of private companies. And so I want to talk a little bit about, I've been thinking also about the presentation we heard this morning from Professor Jones, where he was talking about promise versus peril. And I guess I want to think about the peril a little bit of risk assessment. There's no doubt that risk assessment is ubiquitous. I mean, it is all over and growing in an astonishingly large rate. John and I actually do different kinds of risk assessment. I look at risk assessment generally for the felon population who will be rearrested if placed under different kinds of community sanctions, who will be reconvicted, reincarcerated, who do we want, as I think the judge also said, who do we want to place in prison, who do we want to put under probation, what kinds of conditions, reduce recidivism. So I look at a general population where I think John looks more at mental illness and the prediction of violence. So with some of that, because some of my comments, I find different factors related to predicting increased recidivism. And that's just to mention that we're looking at different kinds of population. And it might be also, by the time I'm finished, you will think that I'm not in favor of risk assessment. The truth is I actually am. But I'm also kind of buyer beware. And because I was involved at the early part of my career in developing the statistical models that produced many of the risk assessments that are now in use, I can go into that database and try to provide some of the. It's absolutely true that the use of risk assessment, as John mentioned, improves accuracy. In fact, even the best trained federal probation officers, this has been run on probation agents, who are trained, more educated than state probation agents, who know about individual behavior even after they've gone through extensive training about cognition, kind of what works literature, evidence-based programming. Even their accurate predictions can be improved by 10 to 20% if they use an actuarial risk protection as opposed to simply their clinical judgments. So there's absolutely no question, it's been settled in the literature, that actuarial risk prediction devices improve recidivism prediction. And they have an empirical base. They also improve consistency in sentencing, which is important. They also, importantly, and this is why I think that they will continue to grow in every sector of criminal justice decision making, they allow us to redirect resources. We don't think about this as being the reason why so many agencies are adopting risk assessment. Not because they really think it improves individual decision making, but it allows, in a time of shrinking budgets, agencies to reallocate their allocated dollars to their highest risk clients. So we're seeing a lot of agents who are very, if you go out and interview agents, and the judge mentioned that I'm evaluating the prison downsizing as a response to Plata Coleman. Now, I think we have one California judge. We've in the last 9 months downsized our prison population by 40,000, which is the biggest decline in a prison population ever conducted in U.S. history. The state, without going into a lot of detail, allocated to the counties $1 billion. $1 billion in the first year and $1.3 billion in the second year. We're 16 months into it. Part of what I have 4 grants looking at various aspects of how this is going to impact California. But one of the grants has been tracking the money. What did counties choose to spend their money on right out of the gate? Number one thing, given our topic, risk assessment tools. Every probation department in California went out and purchased, if they didn't have already, a risk assessment tool. Sheriffs out of 58 counties, we've got about 40 counties that have now purchased a risk assessment tool. We have got risk assessment on steroids. I mean, they didn't fund treatment. They had widespread discretion. They could have funded anything they wanted. And the number one thing they funded quickly was a risk assessment tool. Now, why do we think, is it a good thing? I basically think it is somewhat of a good thing. But I also am quite worried. Why was everybody, first of all, a huge industry has grown up selling all these counties these risk assessment tools as if it was, the golden grail. So we do have this private industry that has grown up and is selling risk assessment tools that were validated in Canada, in Europe, in other states, to California probation, parole, jail. Risk assessment tools that were developed on juveniles to adult populations. Risk assessment who was developed on adult probationers for using how to supervise adult parolees. So we've got all kinds of violations of underlying science. Okay, so what I was just going to explain is if you think about what a risk assessment tool, and if I haven't answered your question, re-ask it to make sure I did cover it. But think about what a risk assessment tool is. It's a regression model. If you think about it, and part of the reasons they've grown so dramatically is with the onset of computers. We now collect a lot of information about people. They go into computers. We can get huge sample sizes. We can collect every bit of information about them. We can collect, as you just asked, both static, things that are unchangeable about the person, age, race, where they live, what their education level is, what their family situation was growing up, two-parent, one-parent household. Or we can also select dynamic factors, things that are changeable, substance abuse, attitude, gang violations, gang associations, etc. Now, so you throw all of this into the computer, and it comes out with graphs like John showed you. Probability of another event, low, medium, high, very high. I actually was responsible for developing something called the California Static Risk Assessment Tool. It is the current risk assessment tool that the California prison system was using to decide who should get out under what kinds of conditions. We made a policy decision early on. If you think of the title of the risk assessment tool, California Static Risk Assessment Tool. In the state legislature, it was decided to drop out all the dynamic factors. Dynamic factors are things like where the person lives, things that treatment, etc. We dropped out all of that, and California decided to only use 10 items. 7 of the items are prior criminal record. They thought that would be the fairest. So we simply use age, gender, prior record. We dropped out race, which was another high predictor. I want to make one particular point. That is a policy choice. When you drop out a lot of the factors, you lose predictive power. So in California, we're using a risk assessment tool that is about 60 to 65% accurate. It's better than chance, which would be about 50%. We're improving our accuracy a little bit, and importantly, we could have improved our accuracy actually about 20 to 22% if we included everything we knew about the offender. But we thought that some of it was inappropriate, so we dropped it out. But I want to tell you why I have problems with it. And I've only started thinking about why I had problems with it because it's just been off the shelf, just, no buyer beware or no scientific caution. Now I want to talk about a couple of things that is wrong with risk assessment tools, especially when we purchase them from providers that are making money and selling us instruments that have not been validated locally. One is they're not location sensitive. And for example, one of the biggest predictors in California is whether or not a juvenile was committed to a California juvenile custody environment. So if they were the old CYA, for state custody for a juvenile. Age at first arrest, highly predictive. Now, what goes on in the California prison system, the youth prisons, used to be incredibly criminogenic. You would never send a kid there if you had any other options. Nothing good happened in the old CYA. I think we're doing better now. So yes, it was predictive. Kids that went there, first of all, they were probably worse to begin with, and they got worse when they got out. That is highly predictive, but it may not be true in other states. Missouri has a totally different youth system, Florida, some of the other states, where they have small group homes. Would that be, sending somebody to a youth facility in your state so highly predictive of increased recidivism if you didn't look at your juvenile facilities? It may, in fact, be producing some good effects, and we see that in other states. So it's got to be validated in your local system. It also has to be time sensitive. You saw in some of the risk prediction tools, and the ones I've now reviewed so many risk assessment tools because I was also on the state commission that decided which risk assessment tool California was going to use, and we decided to use none of them and develop our own. Part of the reasons were because some of these are not time sensitive. For example, a highly predictive factor is whether or not a youth grew up in a single parent household. Well, those risk predictions were developed in the 80s, where I think divorce and single parent households were much less common. That growing up in a single parent household possibly was a different experience than growing up in a single parent household today. I'm not so sure that that factor of two-parent household would actually hold through. So we don't continue to validate and become time sensitive or context sensitive. We tend to take these factors that were predictive in another location, in another time period, and reproduce them in our own sentencing systems. Another thing, we're not context sensitive. Another factor that we often use, and I use this for my class, I don't think anybody's here from Missouri, but you can go up to the Missouri Sentencing Commission, and they have a Mosaic computer program. You enter in crime type, a few factors about the offender, and it prints out the recommended sentence. Now, I had my students do this, I use this as an example. Take the exact same offender and put in unemployed versus employed. Often simply that one factor can shift the sentence recommendation for a community-based alternative versus go to prison. The go to prison is the person that was unemployed. Well, when the unemployment rate was 5%, maybe being unemployed meant something. When we now know that in inner city communities, the unemployment rate may be 20 or 30% in some locations, is being unemployed predictive? And ironically, this really hits them both times. They're unemployed, so we send them to prison, they get out, and then they become unemployed because now they've got a prison record and that attaches collateral consequences. This gets fed back into the computer model that in fact increases the power of unemployment. So we have to really think hard, and I would encourage you all as judges, which often I suspect, because I've looked at some probation reports, you get the final recommended sentence or the score, or you get the low, medium, high risk, but I doubt that many of you have ever asked to first go back and see what the items are, and then ask some hard questions about why your particular location is using the risk assessment tool it is. I've spent a lot of time on this issue trying to find out the very popular one that is now being used in the United States is something called the Level of Service Inventory Revised, LSRI. I suspect that most of you are being driven by decisions that are using that particular instrument. You cannot find out. It's sold commercially. where it was validated. I now know that it was validated in 7 states because I've spent a lot of time trying to find this out. 7 states over 20 years ago. One of the states is South Dakota. You know, I don't think that they tell us on there that gang affiliation is not a predictor of recidivism. Well, maybe it's not a predictor of recidivism in North Dakota. It's certainly it means something here in California. So I think we need to measure that and think hard about what's going in the input. I also want to quickly say something about what we're predicting. So, you know, recidivism has no uniform definition in the United States. It can be arrest, conviction, return to incarceration. It can be whatever we want it to be. It can be over a 3-year period, a 6-month period. So we have no real definition. Now, let's say, so criminologists recommend that you use the behavior, the recidivism outcome closest to the behavior, which would be arrest. Because if let's say you predict, this computer model is now predicting conviction or reincarceration. We know that conviction is furthest from the behavior, and all kinds of policy and system variables enter. What was filed, what kind of defense attorney the person had, what kind of sweat witness. I loved that discussion we had. You know, so the conviction may be beyond what the offender did. So criminologists always say, measure arrest foremost. But let's even be questioning about arrest. Who is likely to get arrested? We know that the probability of arrest is not a clean indicator of criminal behavior. We had a discussion here this morning about the drug war. When is an arrest, say all of us are using the same drugs, same time, but you happen to live in inner city Oakland where there's a lot of police presence. You are much higher probability of getting arrested. So what we're predicting already has some bias in it. So I think we not only need to think about the inputs, I think we need to get smarter about thinking about the outputs, and especially because I think that risk prediction is here to stay, and what gives me real hope actually is the fact of meetings like this. You know, I have never been to a meeting where anybody spent 5 minutes talking about what is going into a risk assessment tool. To have that kind of scientific scrutiny that I saw you all giving to the neuroscience. I've never been to a meeting where these questions were asked about risk assessment. And yet we're using risk assessment all over the place. How many of you in your courtrooms have been provided from risk assessment designations that probably come from your federal probation department, your officers, I assume? Have you not been provided?
You could ask us that next week. A lot of us would be very interested in go back to our probation department.
I think
Pre-trial release and so forth. That's exactly what they do.
so. I'm now working with sheriffs in California who the jail population, because of the prison downsizing, we're starting to, our jail population is now rising. Now the sheriffs, how can we start using risk assessment to start letting people out? Pulling those same risk assessments that were never designed for pretrial release, they were designed they were designed for parole release. And so I guess I think that this, I don't know what network, but I've become increasingly interested in the poor science going on to something I think that is going to be growing within the criminal law, in criminal sentencing, that private providers are going to be selling additional risk assessment tools without much scrutiny, and maybe this is the kind of group who might give it some scrutiny.